Deola stood at her bedroom window, watching the world she could no longer touch. Outside, the village of Aytoro bustled with life, women carrying baskets to the market, children playing in the dusty streets, men returning from their farms. But for her, these simple joys had become distant memories, like dreams that fade in morning light. Her mother had come again today. Deola had heard the familiar knock, the gentle voice calling her name, but like every other time, she had remained silent, her heart breaking as she listened to her mother's footsteps fade away. The consequences of answering that door would be far worse than the pain of staying quiet. In the mirror across her room, Deola caught a glimpse of the heavy metal belt around her waist, her husband's latest show of control. The steel was cold against her skin, a constant reminder of her cage. Kunle, the man who had promised her a life of luxury, had instead given her a prison of gold. Her beautiful home, filled with expensive furniture and decorations, felt more suffocating than the humble mud house where she had grown up. The village gossips who had once envied her marriage to the wealthy Kunle now whispered different stories. They spoke of the screams they heard at night, of the bruises they glimpsed when her wrapper slipped, of how the once vibrant Deola had become a shadow. But none dared to help. After all, Kunle's influence in the village ran deep as his pockets. At night, when the house grew quiet except for the chirping of crickets, Deola would sometimes think of her old life. She would remember the warmth of her mother's hugs, the sound of her father's laughter, and most painfully, the gentle touch of Gbemi, the man who had given her his kidney before they had even fallen in love, the same man who had been deemed too poor to marry her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her room, Deola heard the familiar sound of Kunle's footsteps approaching the house. Her body tensed instinctively, and she quickly moved away from the window. Another night was beginning in her gilded cage, where wealth had become her warden and marriage her sentence. Little did she know that fate was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shatter her prison walls in ways she could never have imagined. 5 years earlier, in the same village hospital where babies were born and elders took their last breaths, a young farmer named Gbemi sat beside his dying father. The air smelled of medicine and worry, and the wooden bench beneath him had grown hard after hours of waiting. But none of that mattered when he heard the commotion 3 beds away. "Please, our daughter needs a kidney." A woman's voice cracked with desperation. "We've tested everyone in the family. No one matches." Gbemi looked up to see a couple standing over their daughter's bed. The girl lay still, her face as pale as the sheets beneath her. He didn't know her name then, didn't know she was Deola, but something in her peaceful face, even in sickness, made his heart pause. Without thinking twice, Gbemi stood up. His father, drifting in and out of consciousness, squeezed his hand weakly. "Go," the old man whispered, as if he could read his son's thoughts. "Help them." The doctors were surprised when Gbemi volunteered to be tested. They were even more surprised when his kidney was a perfect match. "But you don't even know her," they said. Gbemi just smiled and rolled up his sleeve for the blood test. When Gbemi woke up from the surgery, his body aching and his side bandaged, the first news he received was of his father's passing. Tears rolled down his face, not just for his loss, but for the strange mix of pain and purpose he felt. His father had lived his life helping others, and in his final moments, he had blessed his son's decision to do the same. As weeks passed and strength returned to his limbs, Gbemi found himself visiting Deola's ward more often. He watched her color return, her smile brighten, and her laugh. Oh, her laugh was like the first rain after a long drought. They talked about everything and nothing. His small farm, her dreams of opening a shop, the stories their grandparents used to tell. Love grew between them like a seed neither had planted, but both carefully tended. Gbemi worked harder than ever on his farm, saving every coin he could. The village saw him leaving before dawn and returning after dusk, his hands calloused, but his smile unwavering. When he finally gathered enough to pay half of Deola's bride price, his happiness lit up the whole village. But happiness, like the morning mist, can fade quickly under the harsh sun of reality. Word of Deola's beauty and her steadfast heart had reached Kunle, the wealthy merchant who collected beautiful things like others collected cowrie shells. He had heard whispers of her virtue, her kindness, and most importantly to him, her purity. What Kunle wanted, Kunle bought. And so he set his sights on the girl whose life had been saved by a farmer's sacrifice, whose heart had been won by a farmer's love, but whose hand could be purchased with a merchant's gold. Little did anyone know that this simple love story, born in a hospital ward and nurtured in the fertile soil of sacrifice, would soon become a tale of betrayal, imprisonment, and ultimately justice that the entire village would never forget. On the day that changed everything, Kunle arrived at Deola's family compound, carrying a leather bag heavy with gold. The morning sun caught the silver rings on his fingers as he stepped through the low doorway of their mud house. Deola's father, who had spent his life bending over a small plot of yam field, felt his breath catch at the sight of such wealth. Your daughter, Kunle said, his voice smooth as honey, is worth more than what a mere farmer could ever offer. He opened the bag, and gold coins spilled across the wooden table like fallen stars. I will double whatever Gbemi has paid, and add this much more for your family's comfort. Deola's father's hands trembled as he touched the coins. Each one represented more money than he had earned in a month of breaking his back in the fields. He thought of the leaking roof they couldn't fix, of his wife's worn wrapper that needed replacing, of all the years of watching his neighbor's children go to school while his stayed home. In the next room, Deola pressed her ear against the mud wall, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. She could hear everything: the clink of coins, the smooth promises, the sound of her future being sold. Her mother stood beside her, gripping her hands so tight it hurt. But Gbemi saved her life. Her mother's voice quivered as she stepped into the room with the men. He gave our daughter his kidney when she was dying. How can we? Did I ask him to? Deola's father cut her off, his voice sharp with sudden authority. Did we beg him for his kidney? He gave it freely, and free gifts don't come with chains. Deola burst into the room then, her face wet with tears. Baba, please, she begged, falling to her knees before her father. I love Gbemi. He has done so much for us. Please don't do this. And her father wouldn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the gold coins, seeing in them all the dreams he'd never dared to dream. Love doesn't put food on the table, he said. Love doesn't fix leaking roofs. Love doesn't pay for medicine when you're sick. The news spread through the village like fire through dry grass. Gbemi heard it while working in his farm, the same farm he had spent extra hours tending to earn Deola's bride price. His host slipped from his calloused hands, striking the earth with a dull thud that echoed the breaking of his heart. That evening, as the sun painted the sky the color of blood, Gbemi made one last attempt. He went to Deola's father, carrying all he owned in a small bag: his savings, his mother's gold bracelet, even the title to his small farm. But Deola's father refused to even look inside. Don't come here again, he warned Gbemi, standing tall in his newfound wealth. My daughter will marry Kunle in 7 days. That is final. From her window, Deola watched the man she loved walk away, his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible burden. The same shoulders that had stayed strong through the kidney surgery, that had carried her family's burdens without complaint, now seemed crushed under the weight of betrayal. That night, while Deola's father counted his gold by lamplight, his wife turned her face to the wall, her pillow wet with silent tears. In her own room, Deola clutched the small bracelet Gbemi had given her, made from simple copper wire, but shaped with hours of careful love. And somewhere in his small hut, Gbemi sat alone, touching the scar on his side where they had taken the kidney he had given to save the woman he was now forbidden to love. The village elders would later say that betrayal, like a poisoned arrow, wounds not just its target, but all who touch it. And in the years to come, when people spoke of this story, they would remember not just the glitter of Kunle's gold, but the deeper wealth of Gbemi's love, and how a father's greed had traded one for the other. The changes in Kunle came like storm clouds gathering over a sunny day, slowly at first, then all at once. In their first week of marriage, he showered Deola with gifts: silk wrappers from distant lands, gold jewelry that caught the sun, and promises sweet as palm wine. Their new home, with its tall windows and painted walls, seemed like a palace compared to her father's humble dwelling. But beneath the glitter of wealth lay a darkness deep as a midnight well. It started with a look, A sharp glance when a male visitor's eyes lingered too long on Deola. Then came the words, soft but cutting. Why did you smile at that man? Are you trying to shame me? Soon, the questions became accusations, and the accusations became rage. The first time Kunle raised his hand to her, it was because a market trader had helped her pick up dropped oranges. That night, as Deola pressed a cool cloth to her swollen cheek, she heard him pacing outside their bedroom, muttering about women's faithlessness. No visitors, he announced one morning, his voice flat as a dead snake. Not even your family. When Deola tried to protest, he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I bought you fair and square. Your father took my gold. You're mine now. The windows that had once seemed so grand became the bars of her cage. From behind them, she watched life flow past like a river she could no longer touch. She saw her mother coming to visit, week after week, calling her name with increasing desperation. Each time, Deola pressed herself against the wall, silent tears falling, knowing that answering would only bring Kunle's wrath down on them both. But the greatest irony, the one that made the village gossip shake their heads in wonder, was what Kunle himself did when he left their home. While Deola sat trapped in their gilded cage, he prowled the village like a hungry leopard, seeking other men's wives. His money opened doors that should have stayed closed, bought smiles that should have stayed hidden. Then came the belt. This will keep you faithful, Kunle said one morning, holding up the heavy metal contraption. His eyes gleamed with a fevered light as he locked it around her waist. The key disappeared into his pocket like a small snake slithering into its hole. Now I can trust you. The belt bit into Deola's flesh like cold teeth. Each movement became a reminder of her imprisonment. At night, she dreamed of the simple copper bracelet Gbemi had given her, now hidden in a small box beneath her clothes. Its memory hurt more than the steel around her waist. But fate has a way of balancing scales, and Kunle's day of reckoning approached like a storm on the horizon. One evening, he didn't return home. As Deola waited, the belt weighing heavy on her body and heavier on her spirit, she didn't know that her husband's own unfaithfulness had finally snared him in a trap of his own making. The village nights grew longer, filled with whispers of a wealthy man caught in a supernatural trap, punishment for sleeping with another man's wife. These whispers would soon grow into shouts, and the man who had locked his wife in chains would find himself bound by powers far beyond his control. Somewhere in the village, a locksmith kept his tools ready, waiting for the moment when a trapped woman would seek freedom from her metal prison. And somewhere else, a charm maker smiled, knowing his spell had caught a particularly deserving prey in its web. When Deola finally broke free from her metal prison, it was not with a dramatic explosion of rebellion, but with quiet desperation. The village locksmith's hands trembled as he removed the belt, his eyes filling with tears at the sight of the bruises it had left. Freedom, when it came, felt both wonderful and terrifying, like standing in bright sunlight after months in darkness. But her husband was still missing. The strange man she met at her gate that morning had eyes that seemed to see through walls. Your husband, he said, his voice carrying the weight of secret knowledge. Oh yes, I know where he is. Follow me, if you dare to see the truth. They walked to the edge of the village, where the river whispered ancient secrets to the reeds. There, in a small hut that smelled of herbs and broken promises, Deola found her husband, the great and wealthy Kunle, trapped by the very sins he had accused her of. The scene before her seemed pulled from a tale told to scare unfaithful spouses. Kunle lay there, bound not by metal like the belt he had forced upon her, but by powerful magic, caught in the act with another man's wife. The charm maker's spell had done what no lock or chain could do. It had revealed the truth of who Kunle really was. The village gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others turned away in embarrassment. But all understood the poetry of the moment. The man who had kept his wife locked away, who had accused her of imagined infidelities, now lay exposed in his own unfaithfulness. Please, Kunle begged when he saw Deola, his pride finally broken. Help me. The same voice that had commanded her, threatened her, belittled her, now cracked with fear. The charm maker stepped forward, his face grave. The spell can be broken, he said, but the price is high. Freedom sometimes costs more than the gold in your coffers. Deola felt the weight of all eyes upon her. In that moment, she remembered every tear she had shed, every bruise she had hidden, every silent scream she had swallowed. Yet when she spoke, her voice carried no hatred, only a deep, tired sadness. "Break the spell," she said. "No one deserves to die in chains, even ones of their own making. But fate, or perhaps justice, had other plans. When the charm maker broke the spell, something broke in Kunle too. Perhaps it was the shame, perhaps the magic itself, or perhaps his own demons finally claiming their due. Within moments, the wealthy man who had thought his money could buy him anything, love, loyalty, trust, closed his eyes for the last time. The village fell silent. Even the river seemed to hold its breath. Deola stood there, free at last, but the price of that freedom left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had not wanted revenge, had not wished for death. She had only wanted what every heart longs for, to love and be loved in return. As the villagers carried Kunle's body away, an old woman touched Deola's arm. "Child," she said softly, "sometimes the gods use harsh medicines to cure deep sicknesses. Your chains are broken now, both the ones around your waist and the ones around your heart." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in colors of endings and beginnings, Deola walked home alone. The village that had once whispered about her imprisonment now whispered about her dignity in the face of tragedy. She was no longer the prisoner in the big house. She was a woman who had faced the worst of human nature and emerged with her own humanity intact. In her bedroom, she opened the small box where she had kept Gbemi's copper bracelet hidden. Its simple circle spoke of a love that needed no locks, no chains, no prison. She slipped it onto her wrist, feeling its familiar weight, so different from the belt she had been forced to wear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new decisions. But tonight, she was simply free, and that was enough. Time has a way of healing wounds, not by erasing them, but by teaching us how to carry them. In the months that followed Kunle's death, Deola learned to walk in her freedom like a person learning to trust their legs after a long illness. Each morning brought new discoveries. The joy of walking to the market alone, the pleasure of greeting neighbors, the simple miracle of choosing when to open or close her own door. The house that had been her prison now became her sanctuary. As the sole heir to Kunle's wealth, she could have sold it and moved away, but something made her stay. Perhaps it was the need to prove that walls that once held darkness could learn to hold light. Her father's visit came on a rain-swept morning. He stood at her gate, older somehow, the proud set of his shoulders now bent with regret. The gold that had blinded him had turned to dust in his hands, leaving only the bitter taste of wrong choices. "My daughter," he said, his voice breaking. "How does a father ask forgiveness for selling his child's happiness?" Deola looked at him. This man who had taught her to walk, whose dreams of a better life had turned into her nightmare, whose love had been twisted by desperation. In his eyes, she saw not the man who had betrayed her, but the father who had once carried her on his shoulders. "Baba," she said softly, coming out of the rain. It was during this time of healing that Gbemi returned to her life, not with grand gestures or demands, but with the same quiet strength that had led him to give his kidney to a stranger years ago. He brought her fresh yams from his farm, sat with her on her veranda, and talked about everything and nothing, just as they used to do in the hospital during their recovery. The village watched their love story rebuild itself, brick by careful brick. They saw how Gbemi never pushed, never rushed, never tried to claim her as property the way Kunle had. Instead, he offered what he had always offered, a heart as steady as the earth beneath their feet. Their wedding, when it came, was nothing like her first. No grand displays of wealth, no heavy bags of gold. Instead, the entire village contributed what they could: food, decorations, music, joy. Deola wore a simple white dress and the copper bracelet that had survived her darkest days. Gbemi's eyes shone with tears when he saw her, not because of her beauty alone, but because of the strength that beauty had grown from. Her father danced at their wedding, not with the frenzied joy of a man counting his gold, but with the humble happiness of a man who had learned wisdom through pain. Her mother's smile finally reached her eyes again, and the village women who had once whispered behind closed doors now sang blessings openly. Together, Deola and Gbemi turned Kunle's wealth into something beautiful. They opened a school where poor children could learn for free, started a fund to help farmers buy their own land, and created a safe house for women trapped in difficult marriages. The money that had once built prison walls now built bridges of hope. In their own home, they hung no locks on their doors. Their windows stayed open to let in light and air. At night, they would sit on their veranda, watching the stars wheel overhead, their hands clasped together, not in possession, but in partnership. Years later, when villagers told their story, they spoke not just of the tragedy and triumph, but of the deeper truth it revealed: that real love needs no chains, that wealth measured in gold is poor compared to wealth measured in kindness, and that sometimes the longest road home leads through the darkest night. And if you visited their village today, you might see an elderly couple sitting on their veranda, a farmer with a scar on his side, and a woman wearing a simple copper bracelet. Their hair has turned gray, but their eyes still shine with the light of a love that survived the strongest storm and grew stronger for the surviving.